3 months later, Karen sat in her backyard, where her pool used to be, sipping coffee in the garden she'd planted in the reclaimed space. Tomatoes grew where the diving board once stood. Sunflowers reached toward the sky from the spot that used to be the deep end. The lawsuit was still pending, but something more interesting had happened in the meantime. The neighborhood had started talking to each other. Karen. Betty Chan's voice called from the fence line. The Henderson sprinkler system is flooding their driveway again. Want to help me grab some sandbags? This was the new normal. Instead of filing violation notices, people actually helped each other solve problems. Revolutionary concept. Coming. Karen called back, setting down her mug. As she stood, her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Heard about your pool situation. HOA president in Riverside having similar issues with PowerMad board member. Any advice? Sandra M. Karen smiled. This was the 15th such text she'd received this week. Word of her rebellion had spread through social media, and suddenly she was becoming the patron saint of fed-up homeowners everywhere. There were even Facebook groups dedicated to the Karen method of HOA resistance. The irony wasn't lost on her that she'd become the good kind of viral Karen. Mrs. Whitmore, a familiar voice made her turn. Marcus Thornfield stood at her back gate, but he looked different, smaller somehow. His usually pristine appearance was rumpled, and there were dark circles under his eyes. Marcus, come to inspect my tomatoes for compliance violations. He didn't laugh. The board voted me out last night. Karen stopped walking. What? Turns out your little speech inspired people to actually read the HOA financials. They discovered I've been billing the association for personal expenses, golf club memberships, restaurant meals, even my car payments. He laughed bitterly, claimed they were necessary for HOA business. The satisfaction Karen expected to feel never came. Instead, she felt something uncomfortably close to pity. How much? She asked. $47,000 over 2 years. Marcus ran his hand through his thinning hair. I'm being sued by the same association I ran for 8 years. They're also dropping the lawsuit against you. Apparently, the legal fees were coming out of my embezzled funds anyway. Karen studied his face, looking for traces of the smug authoritarian who'd measured her pool furniture with a ruler. All she saw was a broken man who'd confused power with purpose. What will you do now? She asked. I don't know. Maybe learn to live without measuring everyone else's hedge height. He paused at the gate. For what it's worth, your garden looks nice. Really nice. After he left, Karen stood among her tomatoes, processing the strange turn her life had taken. Her phone buzzed again, another message from another desperate homeowner in another community ruled by petty tyrants. Betty appeared at the fence again. Everything okay? You look contemplative. Just thinking about unintended consequences, Karen replied. I tore down my pool to prove a point about stupid rules and accidentally started a movement. Accidentally. Karen grinned. Maybe not entirely accidentally. Her phone rang, and she recognized the number of a local news station. They'd been calling for weeks, wanting to do a story about her pool demolition and its aftermath. She'd been avoiding them, but maybe it was time. Karen Whitmore speaking, she answered. Ms. Whitmore, this is Janet Rodriguez from Channel 7 News. We'd love to schedule an interview about your neighborhood activism and… Actually, Karen interrupted, looking at her garden where her pool used to be. I have a better idea. What if we talked about what communities look like when people help each other instead of policing each other? As she scheduled the interview, Karen noticed something she'd missed before. The Hendersons were in their backyard, and their grass was at least an inch over the approved height limit. 6 months ago, she would have already been drafting a violation notice. Today, she just waved and made a mental note to offer them her lawnmower. Some revolutions start with grand gestures. Others start with someone finally deciding to mind their own damn business. Karen's had started with a sledgehammer and a pool, but it was growing into something much bigger. Her phone buzzed with another text from another desperate homeowner. This time, instead of advice, she sent an address. Maple Grove Estates Community Garden, Saturday 10 a.m. Bring work gloves and an open mind. It was time to scale up the revolution. The emergency HOA meeting was called for 7 p.m. sharp, just 4 hours after Marcus had been revived with smelling salts and the gentle lapping of chlorinated water against his designer loafers. Karen arrived precisely on time, carrying a manila folder thick enough to choke a horse and wearing the navy blazer she'd reserved for her most serious violations hearings. Except tonight, she wasn't the prosecutor. The Maple Grove Estates Community Center buzzed with an energy Karen hadn't felt since the great mailbox controversy of 2019. Every seat was filled, with latecomers pressed against the walls like sardines. She'd lived in this neighborhood for 15 years, and she'd never seen this many residents at a single meeting. "Ladies and gentlemen," Marcus began, his voice still shaky from his earlier fainting spell. "We're here to address the unprecedented destruction of property by Mrs. Karen Whitmore." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Karen stood, her folder clutched against her chest like armor. "I'd like to make a statement," she announced. "Mrs. Whitmore, you're not scheduled to. According to Robert's Rules of Order, which this HOA claims to follow, I have the right to address accusations against me," Karen interrupted. The months of research she'd conducted in preparation for this moment crystallized into cold, hard confidence. "Unless you've abandoned parliamentary procedure along with common sense." Marcus's jaw twitched, but he gestured for her to continue. Karen opened her folder, revealing the fruits of her obsessive documentation. "Over the past 5 years, I've filed 847 violation notices with this HOA. Want to know how many were upheld after appeal?" She paused for dramatic effect. 691. The crowd shifted uncomfortably. These were her neighbors, people she'd cited for everything from slightly overgrown hedges to Halloween decorations left up past November 1st. "I became the neighborhood enforcer because I believed in order, in standards, in the rules we all agreed to follow." Her voice grew stronger with each word. "But somewhere along the way, I realized I wasn't preserving our community. I was destroying it with nitpicking nonsense." Betty Chen, who'd received 4 citations for her garden gnome collection, called out, "So why tear down your pool?" Karen smiled, not the tight, controlled expression she usually wore, but something genuine and slightly unhinged. "Because Marcus here decided my pool furniture was the wrong shade of blue. Not the wrong color, the wrong shade. Mediterranean blue instead of ocean mist. $50 a day in fines for a color difference you need a microscope to see." The crowd erupted in murmurs. Several people pulled out their phones, presumably to Google the difference between Mediterranean blue and ocean mist. "The pool cost me $75,000 to install," Karen continued. "Rather than pay thousands in fines for furniture that's functionally identical to the approved color, I chose to eliminate the problem entirely." Marcus was turning purple. "You can't just destroy property to avoid violations." "Actually, I can." Karen pulled out a thick legal document. "I had 3 attorneys review the HOA bylaws. There's nothing preventing homeowners from removing amenities from their own property, provided it doesn't affect neighboring lots or violate city codes. I have permits for everything." The room fell silent except for the sound of Marcus's labored breathing. "But here's what really bothers me," Karen said, her voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried to every corner of the room. "I spent 5 years making everyone in this neighborhood miserable over things that don't matter. Paint colors, mailbox heights, how many seconds your trash can sit on the curb. I turned our community into a police state, and I was the police." Diane Peterson, who'd received more citations than anyone except the Henderson family, stood up slowly. "Are you apologizing?" Karen met her gaze directly. "I'm saying I'm done. Done with the petty enforcement, done with the constant surveillance, done with caring more about rule compliance than about the people who live here. This is ridiculous." Marcus sputtered. "We have standards, property values, order. We have misery." Karen shot back. "When's the last time anyone in this room had a friendly conversation with their neighbor instead of worrying about whether their lawn height might trigger a violation?" The silence stretched uncomfortably long. Finally, old Mr. Henderson raised his hand. "So what happens now?" he asked. Karen closed her folder and looked around the room at faces she'd been terrorizing for years. People who were now looking at her with something approaching curiosity instead of fear. "Now I find out who I am when I'm not the neighborhood bitch," she said. But as she turned to leave, Marcus's voice stopped her cold. "The board has voted." The sledgehammer connected with the pristine pool tiles at exactly 7:03 am, sending turquoise fragments flying across Karen Whitmore's manicured backyard, like confetti at a very expensive, very destructive party. From her kitchen window, neighbor Betty Chen nearly choked on her morning coffee as she watched the HOA's most notorious rule enforcer systematically destroying what had once been the crown jewel of Maple Grove Estates. "Holy shit, Karen's lost it," Betty whispered, fumbling for her phone to capture what would undoubtedly become the neighborhood's most legendary meltdown. Karen paused mid-swing, her designer workout clothes already splattered with concrete dust and pool water. For the first time in her 15-year reign, as the neighborhood's self-appointed compliance officer, she felt genuinely alive. The weight of the sledgehammer in her perfectly manicured hands was intoxicating, so much more satisfying than wielding her usual weapon of choice, strongly worded violation notices. The chaos began 3 weeks earlier when HOA President Marcus Thornfield had the audacity to cite her for having pool furniture that was Mediterranean blue instead of the association-approved ocean mist. The color difference was imperceptible to any reasonable human being, but Marcus had arrived with his little measuring tape and paint samples, his smug smile growing wider with each infraction he documented. "Mrs. Whitmore, I'm afraid this shade violates Section 4.72 of our aesthetic guidelines," he'd announced, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses with theatrical precision. "You have 30 days to replace all furniture or face daily fines of $50. Karen had stared at him for a full 10 seconds, processing the absurdity. Here was a man who let his garbage bins sit on the curb for 3 days after pickup, lecturing her about aesthetic compliance. Something deep inside her, something that had been building pressure like a volcano for years, finally erupted. "You know what, Marcus?" she'd said, her voice unnaturally calm. "You're absolutely right. This pool area is completely out of compliance." That's when she'd hatched her plan. Now, as chunks of her $75,000 custom pool crashed into the deep end, Karen felt a perverse sense of satisfaction. Let them try to fine her for Mediterranean blue furniture when there was no pool to put it around. She'd checked the HOA bylaws 17 times. There was no rule against homeowners demolishing their own amenities. Karen, what the hell are you doing?" The screech came from her next-door neighbor, Diane Peterson, who was hanging over the fence like a suburban vulture. Karen waved cheerfully, pool water dripping from her elbows. "Spring cleaning, Diane. Really getting to the root of things this year." The sound of screeching tires announced Marcus's arrival. He burst through her back gate, a violation of privacy she'd normally cite him for, his face the color of an overripe tomato. His briefcase fell open, spilling violation forms across her wet concrete like oversized confetti. "You can't. This is the property values," Marcus sputtered, gesturing helplessly at the destruction. "According to Section 12.34, I can make any modifications to my property that don't affect neighboring lots," Karen replied sweetly, raising the sledgehammer again. "I had 3 structural engineers confirm that pool removal won't impact drainage or property lines." Marcus's eyes rolled back in his head, and he crumpled to the ground in a dead faint, landing partially in the shallow end of Karen's rapidly disappearing pool. Karen looked down at the unconscious HOA president, then at the growing crowd of neighbors gathering like spectators at a car crash. For the first time in years, she wasn't the one filing a complaint. She was the one causing them.